Good morning. It's good to be here with you again this morning, and it's good to see we've almost got a packed house. I don't know if this will hold us much longer, but that's good. That's a good thing. I want to say thank you for everyone who is visiting. We want you to know that you're our most honored guest, and if you are a West Sider and you see someone visiting, be sure to reach out your proverbial hand and extend a welcome. Who here knows the name Rufus Xavier Sarsaparilla? Rufus Xavier Sarsaparilla. If you know Rufus Xavier Sarsaparilla, then you know that he has a sister named Raffaella Gabriella Sarsaparilla. And they're brother and sister, and they have a friend who's named Albert Andreas Armadillo. And all of them respectively found an aardvark, a kangaroo, and a rhinoceros. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, it's from an old cartoon, Schoolhouse Rock. I grew up with it. The purpose of the show was to teach pronouns, because no one wants to say Rufus Xavier Sarsaparilla every time you talk about Rufus Xavier Sarsaparilla or Sister Raffaella Gabriella Sarsaparilla. Especially when they find an aardvark, a kangaroo, and a rhinoceros, respectively. I thought about that show. My kids were watching that for the first time, and I was it's kind of taking me back to my childhood, watching that show and learning about pronouns in song form. And I remember watching that not too long ago, and while all of these characters were in a bus with the aardvark, kangaroo, and rhinoceros, everybody in the bus is, going crazy and freaking out, and they start saying, "What is this? Which ones are these?" And these are still pronouns. What, which. And I thought, I forgot those were pronouns, right? And it's relevant to what we're talking about this morning, because there is something very interesting in Colossians chapter 1 where Paul says in verse 14, "In whom." Whom is a pronoun. It's a relative pronoun. Now the song's not going to identify that's a relative pronoun, but it's just going to identify that's a pronoun. But I want to get a little nerdy with you this morning. That is a relative pronoun. And what's interesting about relative pronouns is you've got to know what the relative pronoun is referring to. For example, if you're talking about Rufus Xavier Sarsaparilla and you say he, it's got to be in the context of Rufus Xavier Sarsaparilla. Or she, it's got to be in the context of Raffaella Gabriella Sarsaparilla. So my question here in this verse is, who is whom referring to? Who is whom referring to? Well, we got to go to the verse prior. It says in verse 13, he. Okay, there's another pronoun. What's he referring to? Well, he is referring to God, and we studied that last week and the week before, so we won't get too much into that. So he. So is the whom in verse 14 referring to the he in verse 13? Well, maybe. He has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom. There's another noun, kingdom. See, in Greek, it's very interesting that the Greek word is kind of the same. The relative pronoun doesn't really change. It does, but we'll get there in just a second. The point is, if this was referring to kingdom, then we would translate this in which we have redemption. Okay, does that work? If not, why not? And so he says the kingdom of the Son, okay, is the whom referring to the Son, of his love, is the which, the relative pronoun, is it referring to the love, in which case it was in which. Well, see, kingdom is in the feminine in Greek, basileia, which the whom is the masculine, so it doesn't match up. I've got a point with this. And love is agape, and it's also in the feminine, and the whom is the masculine, so it doesn't match up. The point that I'm trying to say here, the point that I'm trying to make is here, this is very specifically referring to in whom being the Son. And the reason why that's important is because Paul is changing the focus. He's not completely changing it, but he has been talking about God, and now in whom, in that one word, he's saying we're going to start talking about this one. In whom. And that's really important because who we're about to talk about, he's about to show, is essential. Absolutely essential to everything. He is superior. Absolutely superior to everything. As a matter of fact, he holds together everything. He's essential to everything. He's superior to everything, and he holds everything together. And so it's essential that we understand what the pronoun is referring to. In that one tiny word, Paul's saying we're going to start talking about Jesus. And so he says, in whom we have redemption. You remember last week we talked about the idea of deliverance being the idea of being rescued. And when you need rescuing, it means that you're in a position where you cannot rescue yourself. And you need someone to rescue you. This word is similar. It's redemption. It's deliverance. It's being released from a captive condition, which means you are captive to something and you need to be released from that captivity, released from that bondage, released from that slavery. In whom we have redemption through his blood. The blood is essential to the redemption process. The blood of Jesus is what makes the redemption process, the purchasing process of getting you and I out of slavery, bondage, captivity, into freedom. The blood is an essential part of that process. And he goes on to explain that this process is the forgiveness of sins. That's what we're talking about. If you say, well, what is redemption? What are we talking about? We're talking about the forgiveness of sins, wherein we learn who is the captor, the sin. What is the prison? It's the sin. What is the burden? It's the sin. It is the thing that is controlling the world, controlling people's behaviors, controlling people's thoughts, controlling them from a very early age, where they get to make a decision between what is right and what is wrong, and choosing the wrong, as you and I did all those years ago. And when we made the decision to choose what was wrong, to make those mistakes that we're trying to forget about, it took control of us and put us into that prison and put us into that bondage of which we could not get out of by ourselves, that we could not escape from. That redemption process. See, Jesus is essential to the redemption process because Jesus shed his blood. Jesus was born as a human being. He was born as a human being. It was essential that he was born as a human being because as a human being, he had blood. And in having blood, he could then live his life and die and shed his blood. And the reason why that's important is because that is what's going to forgive the sins. It is the sacrifice that's going to forgive the sins. And you ask the question, couldn't it be some other way? Why couldn't it be some other way? Does it have to be through the blood of Christ? Is Jesus really essential to everything? And Jesus is the one who actually, when he was suffering in the garden, posed this question. He actually posed this question. He said, is there any other way? Jesus understood theologically that there was no other way. But emotionally, he asked God, is there any other way? It's implied in his request, let this cup pass before me. And in God's response, in God's answer, you see that there is no other way. There is no other solution to the problem, to the redemption process, to the deliverance process, to the transference process. You remember when we talked about being on that path of darkness and then being transferred into the kingdom of the Son of his love. See, that transference process, when Jesus asked the question, is there any other way? He's asking if there's any other way for this redemption, this transference, this deliverance, this forgiveness to take place. And God says, no. There is no other way. Which contradicts a lot of ideas in the world today. Because there are a lot of people in the world that want to suggest that there are many ways and that all roads lead to the same place. To which we ask the question, then why did Jesus die? Why did he shed his blood? Why did he go to the cross? Why did God answer no when the world is trying to answer yes? And so, he goes to the cross and sheds the blood so that the deliverance, so that the rescuing, so that the transference, so that the redemption, so that the forgiveness can be a possibility. See, we talk about the unforgivable sin. What is that? And we get somewhat scared and we say, oh, I hope I haven't committed that unforgivable sin. And if you have obeyed the gospel, then you have not committed the unforgivable sin. The unforgivable sin is simple. It's just this. It's rejecting the only way to get to God. That's it. It's, as the Hebrew writer says, trampling afoot the blood of Christ. It's rejecting Christ. You know, the Hebrew writer almost tries to get the reader to kind of relive that moment when Jesus was on trial and the mob was chanting, crucify him, crucify him. Because when you reject Jesus as the only way to the Father, you in turn by your behavior are chanting, crucify him, crucify him. What were they saying when they were saying crucify him? They were saying, we don't want him. We don't want him. Get rid of him. And when you say get rid of Jesus, when you say you don't want Jesus, you say I don't want the only way to get to God. And when you say that, you say I don't want God. And so Jesus is in the garden and he's praying. Let this cup pass before me. In other words, is there any other way? And God in turn, in his response, says, Jesus, you are the only way. And in this short sentence, Paul makes it clear that Jesus is essential. Jesus is essential to everything. We had one person try to respond today. Jesus is essential to everything. Verse 15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Very interesting word there, image. In the Greek, it's the word eikon. Eikon. What English word does that sound like? Does it sound like icon? Yeah, icon. That's the word. It's this idea of in the Old Testament. I did a search in the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, and this word is translated many times idol, which I find very fascinating. Because when you think of an idol, you think of a piece of rock, a piece of wood that has been carved into some sort of deity. And here's what's so interesting about those idols. And as a matter of fact, I'm not making this up. God mocked idols very often, very frequently in the Old Testament. And he would try to engage in a conversation with idols, which I always thought, when I read that, I always thought it was kind of humorous, because he's asking them to respond to him and talk to him, and they never do. But these idols, some of them, they would have eyes. They'd carve eyes into the face, but the eyes didn't see anything. And sometimes they would carve a nose on the idol, and the nose didn't function as a nose. The nose didn't smell anything. They would carve a mouth on the face, but the face never spoke to you. Sometimes they would carve ears on the idol, but the ears, they couldn't hear anything when you spoke to them. They'd carve arms, but the arms never reached out to anyone. They carved hands, but the hands never touched anyone. They carved legs and feet, but the legs never took them anywhere. The feet never took them anywhere. See, all they did sometimes is they would take nails, and then they would beat the nails into the base, so that when the wind came, the wind didn't knock the idols over, because the idol couldn't stand up on its own. As a matter of fact, you remember the story of Dagon, when he's standing, and God on numerous occasions quite effortlessly causes Dagon to fall flat on his face until finally his head falls off. Because an idol can't stop itself from falling, and an idol can't keep itself safe. An idol can't protect itself, an idol can't protect others. So I find it very interesting that Paul uses a word here that is so frequently used for man-made idols. Another way that this word is used in the Old Testament is when God says, I will make man in my own image. Very interesting. In the image of God, he made man. You know, it reminds me of an apologist. I tell this story a lot because I love how he says this. It's the scenario where they bring Jesus the coin and they say, should we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus asks the question, whose picture's on the coin? And they say Caesar, and he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God's. And what they should have asked is, what is God's? And I think Jesus would have responded, whose image is on you? Think about that. Who do you belong to? Because there's a lot of people in the world that are living like they don't belong to anybody. Whose image is on you? I find it very interesting that this is the word that Paul uses here, but let's think about this for a second, because sometimes I wonder if the apostles and the disciples really fathomed, really understood the significance of what Paul is saying right here while Jesus was alive and walking and seeing and smelling and speaking and hearing and reaching and touching and walking. I wonder if they understood the significance of what was standing right in front of them. He was literally the physical embodiment of God himself. He was the image. He was the living and breathing, it's going to sound weird, idol, which is not, it doesn't sound right. But when you contrast it with the lifeless, breathless, thoughtless idol, Jesus was the image, the express image, some translations say, of the living God. And I wonder if the disciples, the apostles, when Jesus was standing before them, if they really got that. I wonder if they really grasped that in their lives when he was right there before them. Because I'll tell you one thing, Paul gets it now, doesn't he? He gets it. He may not have grasped it back then. He may not have grasped it when he was persecuting Christians and approving of Christians being put to death. But boy, he gets it now. And the other apostles, I don't know if they got it. I don't know if they really grasped it whenever Jesus was alive. But boy, after he raised and they saw his resurrected body, and after he ascended into heaven, and after the church was established, boy, they really got it. The question for us is, do we get it? Do we get the significance of who this Jesus actually is? Do we understand that he is in fact essential to everything? Because he is God himself. He says the firstborn over all creation. This word firstborn can be a reference to birth order. It can be a reference to birth order. I would say Julian is my firstborn because why? He was born first. And sometimes it's appropriate to use that word in that way. But other times, when you look at someone as in the first century, even before the first century, we'll look at an example in the book of Exodus. You'll see someone saying, they're my firstborn. And you think, wait a second, you weren't born first. You weren't born first. In the book of Exodus, God speaking to the Pharaoh, he says, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Well, even if you take that literally, as in Israel referring to Jacob, which is probably not what he's talking about here, but even if you did do that, was Jacob born first? No, the narrative makes it extremely clear that his brother was born first, and then Jacob was born afterwards. Even though they're twins, there still was a birth order in Israel. God changed his name to Israel. He was not, in fact, born first. So why is God referring to Israel as the firstborn? And you might say, well, no, it's not talking about Jacob literally. It's talking about Jacob or Israel as a nation. And then you think, okay, that's interesting. So when were they born literally? As a nation. It doesn't work that way. Each individual within the nation were born, but the nation itself, I mean, what are we talking about here? Obviously, we're not talking about a literal birth. We're talking about a spiritual one where God is saying, this is my son, and they are my firstborn. And to not understand that there is a figurative sense of this word, I think, is to reject the way that this word was used in the first century and before. For example, a guy named Polycarp in the first or beginning of the second century, he writes a letter to the Philippians, and he is reinforcing what John is teaching in 1 John, where he says if you reject the incarnation, if you reject Jesus came in the flesh, and then he goes on at the end of the quote, he says, you are the firstborn of Satan. Well, he's not saying you were born of Satan in a literal sense. I mean, Satan didn't have a child literally and physically, but figuratively. And so, what is Jesus? Jesus is not the firstborn in birth order. He's not the firstborn in even creation, because that's not how the word was used oftentimes. What it was the way it was used is that of special status of firstborn. In other words, to be considered with the status of a firstborn. Israel, the nation, was considered to God in a very different and holy way compared to any other nation of the world. And Jesus was considered to be supreme over any other who was ever born in the entire world. He was supreme. He was chosen. God said, "This is my beloved Son. Him you should hear. Him you should listen to over anything else, over anyone else." He's supreme over all things. And so Paul is making clear that Jesus is essential to all things. And he is supreme over all things. And he says in verse 16, "For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers." In other words, the origin of all things is dependent on Jesus. A lot of the times I think someone reading this might get confused and go, "Wait a second, are we talking about God right now? God the Father?" Remember whom? Paul's making it very clear. No, we're not talking about God the Father. We're talking about Jesus the Son. He's the one who created all things. He's the one who was there at the beginning. He's the one that all things are in existence because he made it that way. He says all things created through him and for him. In other words, not only is he the origin of all things, but he's the purpose of all things. There are so many people living in the world that are saying, "What is my purpose? Why am I here?" You're here because Jesus. You're here because of him. If it weren't for him, you would not be here. And because of him, you are here. It goes back to the whose image is on you. Why are you here? And Paul is saying, I want you to know why you're here. I want you to know where you come from. I want you to know what your purpose is. And it's summed up in whom? Jesus. And he says, all things were created through him and for him, verse 17. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist. And this kind of confused me, and so I had to look at different translations and try to figure out what this is talking about. In him, all things, New American Standard says, are held together. In him, all things are maintained, are sufficient, are being able to work and function properly. It's because of Jesus that things are able to function. Wait a second. That seems like something that would be talking about God the Father. No, we're talking about God the Son. You know, the elements, the seasons, well, Paul, you're really making Jesus a big deal. And Paul would say, yes, I am. Because he's everything. He says he is the head of the body, the church. I wonder if a lot of people forget about that. I wonder if a lot of Christians maybe forget that. I wonder if sometimes if we make people our head, if we make ideas our head, if we make certain opinions our head. Paul says, no. You're not big enough to be the head. I'm not big enough to be the head. We're not essential enough. We're not supreme enough. We don't hold things together. We can't even fathom that. We're talking about the Godhead. We're talking about theology. We're talking about things that our feeble minds can hardly grasp. And we want to run a church? No. Paul says, you let Jesus do it. He can do it. He's fully qualified. You just let him do it. You just go to him for authority. You just ask him for advice. Whether you're talking about the structure, the organization of the church, or you're talking about the structure, organization of your own individual life, if you're asking how I need to live, how I need to think, you just turn to Jesus because he's everything. And he can help you out. He's the beginning. He's the firstborn from the dead. That in all things he may have preeminence. The question is, in the way that you live your life, does God have all preeminence in your life? In the things that you do, in the things that you say, can people look at your life and say, wow, Jesus has preeminence in that person's life. He is essential over all things. He's supreme over all things. He holds all things together. And thus he is everything. Make him everything in your life. Maybe you're here today and you have not put on Christ in baptism. You've not obeyed the gospel. You have not made him a part of your life. Don't wait another day. Please come now as together we stand and as we sing.